Hello, and thank you so much for joining me again. In the last video, we saw that there really is no tension between Romans 2, which teaches that what we do will play a vital role in final salvation, and Romans 3, which says that justification is by faith apart from the works of the law. There's no tension because Romans 2 is talking about good works of obedience to God, which is part of the faith that justifies us. And Romans 3:28 is talking about works of the Mosaic law, things that were only required for Israel under the Old Covenant, things like circumcision, new moons, Jewish feast days, food laws. Those kinds of things play no role in justification. But good works of obedience to Jesus play a vital role once we have been saved initially, because salvation is about a relationship with Jesus. You have to actually know Him, and there is no relationship with Jesus without obedience to Jesus. The true gospel and the biblical message of salvation is incredibly good news, but it does come with conditions. The true gospel has some teeth on it. And so it will produce hope and joy, but also fear and trembling. It will result in great love for God and for Jesus for what He has done for us, and also in great urgency and sobriety. It is good news unless you have already been indoctrinated with Protestant theology, which tends to tell us what we want to hear. It tends to make us soft, so that when we then hear the true gospel, we'll be afraid and it sounds like bad news and we reject it. And we need to gird up our loins, as Polycarp might say, and we need to act like men and women of faith and wake up to the reality that we actually live in, which is that we need to obey Jesus or we're not going to enter His kingdom when He comes to judge. And that's scary when you've already learned Protestant sort of a Calvinistic or Lutheran kind of way of thinking about all this stuff. But it's the reality we live in, and the sooner we come to terms with that, the sooner our lives will begin to change like the New Testament says they're supposed to. Okay, in this video, I'd like to make 3 points regarding Romans chapter 3. First, I want to talk about a few verses in Romans 3 which are very helpful in continuing to recover Paul's context and his purpose in writing the book of Romans. Second, I want to talk about what Paul means when he says that we are under sin in verse 9. And then third, I want to talk about the famous atonement passage at the end of Romans chapter 3, and that we need to read that passage through the lens of the ransom concept Jesus and the apostles teach, and not through the lens of the penal substitution concept which the Protestant reformers taught. So first, just as in chapter 2, there are a few verses in chapter 3 that are very helpful in recovering the right interpretive lens for reading the book of Romans, for recovering Paul's true purpose and context. And they are verse 1 and verse 9. Verse 1 says, "Then what advantage has the Jew, or what is the value of circumcision?" And verse 9 says, "What then? Are we," meaning Jews, "any better off? No, not at all, for we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin." So do you hear the questions Paul is putting forth there? Do Jews have an advantage over Gentiles? Are Jews any better off than Gentiles? Notice that Paul is discussing Jews and Gentiles, and he asks the question, what is the value of circumcision? But Paul is not talking about obedience and disobedience. He's not contrasting obedience with disobedience. He's not asking questions like, then what advantage has the obedient person? Or what is the value of obedience to God? No, Paul covered the question of obedience in Romans chapter 2, where he says there will be tribulation and distress for every human being who does evil, the Jew first and also the Greek, but glory, honor, and peace for everyone who does good, the Jew first and also the Greek, for God shows no partiality. But now in Romans 3, Paul is trying to make the point that being Jewish and circumcised and keeping the Mosaic law provides no advantage and plays no role in salvation. But see, evangelicals tend to ignore that context. They would read Romans 3 verse 1 like this, as though it's saying, then what advantage do those who obey have? Or what is the value of obedience? They read Romans 3 with obedience and disobedience in mind. And so they take what Paul is saying about being Jewish and circumcised and how that plays no role in salvation, and they apply that to good works of obedience to Jesus, which is a tragic, dangerous error. Or consider Romans 3, verses 28 to 30. For we hold that one is justified by faith apart from works of the law. Or is God the God of Jews only? Is he not the God of Gentiles also? Yes, of Gentiles also, since God is one who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith. So notice that Paul does not ask the question, or is God the God of the obedient only? Right? That's not the question, but that's how evangelicals tend to read verses 28 to 30 in Romans chapter 3, as though it says this, for we hold that one is justified by faith apart from obedience to God. Or is God the God of the obedient only? Is he not the God of the disobedient also? Yes, of those who disobey also, since God is one who will justify the obedient by faith and the disobedient through faith. Now, hopefully that sounds very off to you, as it should. Friends, Paul is not contrasting faith with obedience in Romans 3. Rather, he contrasts faith, which includes obedience to Jesus, Romans 1:5, with being Jewish and with the works of the Mosaic law, the Old Covenant law, circumcision in particular, in this passage. I realize this might feel a little bit repetitive if you watch the last two videos in this Romans series, but in my experience, and this is how it was for me, evangelicals sometimes need to hear this over and over and over again before they start to grasp what this means and before they begin to understand why we need to be very concerned about this today. Okay, the second point I want to make is about what Paul says in verse 9, where he says that both Jews and Gentiles are under sin. He says, what then, are we Jews any better off? No, not at all, for we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin. What does Paul mean primarily when he says both Jews and Gentiles are under sin? Well, years ago, as an evangelical, I would have understood Paul to be saying that we are all under sin in the sense that we have the guilt and the penalty of sin hanging over us, the wrath of God, eternal punishment. That's our big problem. That's what we really need to be released from and saved from. Well, it may be true that we have guilt because of sin and that we have the penalty of sin coming our way if we do not repent. But that's not what Paul means primarily when he says that both Jews and Greeks are under sin. And part of how we know that is what Paul will go on to say right after this, where he quotes from various Psalms and Old Testament passages. Romans 3, 9 to 18. Both Jews and Greeks are under sin, as it is written, no one is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one. Their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of asps is under their lips. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. In their paths are ruin and misery, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. So, what do these quotes from the Psalms and Isaiah and these Old Testament passages, what do they focus on? Do you see anything in there about the penalty of sin? Do they say anything about the wrath of God hanging over people? Do they say anything about Adam's guilt being imputed to people? No, right? They're all talking about how people live. Paul's not focused on the penalty of sin, but he's focused on sin itself. No one seeks for God. No one does good. They use their tongues to deceive. Their mouths are full of curses and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. The way of peace they have not known. They have no fear of God. See, Paul is making the point that Jews, like Gentiles, are under sin in the sense that they too are held captive to sin. All are under sin in the sense that they are enslaved to sin, at least prior to becoming Christians. See, someone can be a Jew outwardly, keeping the regulations of the law of Moses without living a righteous life of love for God and neighbor, like the people who killed the prophets, or who killed Jesus, or who killed Stephen, or people like Paul before he converted, who was blameless according to the Mosaic regulations, as he says in Philippians 3, but who was living an evil life, hating and persecuting people. See, he kept the external Mosaic regulations blamelessly, he tells us in Philippians chapter 3. But Paul was doing evil when it came to how he related to his neighbor. So see, it's slavery to sin that we need to be thinking of primarily when we read Romans, and not the penalty of sin. John 8:33-36. We are offspring of Abraham and have never been enslaved to anyone. How is it that you say we will become free? Jesus answered them, Truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not remain in the house forever. The Son remains forever. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. See, Jesus said in John 8:34 and 36 that whoever sins is a slave of sin, but that if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. And he says that to a group of Jews who were passionate about their genetic relationship to Abraham, and who were circumcised, and who were being careful to obey the Mosaic customs, but who wanted to put Jesus to death, showing that they were actually sons of the devil. See, Jesus can take a man like that. Jesus can take a man like Saul of Tarsus and can set him free and transform him into the man who wrote the book of Romans. As Matthew 1:21 says, Jesus has come to save his people from their sins. Doesn't say the penalty of sin, but from their sins. He's come to deliver them out of the bondage to sin, to actually change the trajectory of their lives and turn them into people who do the will of God. This is what Paul is talking about primarily here in Romans 3. And so perhaps this is why the NIV translates Romans 3:9 in this way. What shall we conclude then? Do we have any advantage? Not at all, for we have already made the charge that Jews and Gentiles alike are all under the power of sin. Now obviously they are taking some liberty there, but the way they translate that does fit the context. And as you'll see, it fits very well with what Paul will go on to say, especially in chapter 6. Read Romans 6 carefully. It is all about how Christians are released and freed from the power of sin. And so, for example, consider what Paul says in Romans 6:13 and 14. Do not offer any part of yourself to sin as an instrument of wickedness, but rather offer yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and offer every part of yourself to him as an instrument of righteousness. For sin shall no longer be your master, because you are not under law, but under grace. Notice what it means to no longer be under law, but to be under grace in Paul's mind. It means that sin is no longer our master. We have the power now to live a righteous life. And so, if under grace means being able to live a righteous life, having been freed from our old master, then to be under sin would mean being under the power of sin, unable to live a righteous life because of slavery to sin, and in need of rescue from that, in need of being delivered from slavery to sin. And that is a good lead-in for the third point I want to make here about Romans 3, that we have to read Paul's famous atonement passage at the end of the chapter through the lens of this ransom idea Jesus taught, and not through the lens of the penal substitution concept which the Protestant reformers taught. Our problem, first and foremost, as human beings, is that we're in captivity to sin. If you're not a Christian, we're in captivity to sin because we are under the influence of Satan. And it's been that way since the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve listened to Satan instead of listening to God. The human race then came under the power of Satan and therefore became enslaved to sinful desires. And Jesus paid the price to break that power and turn us back around again so that we can be forgiven and justified and free of the penalty of sin. But if we do not go free from the power of sin, then we will not be free of the penalty of sin. In Acts 26, Paul gives his testimony to King Agrippa. Picking it up in verse 16, this is Jesus speaking to Paul, telling him what his new mission is. But rise and stand upon your feet, for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to appoint you as a servant and witness to the things in which you have seen me, and to those in which I will appear to you, delivering you from your people and from the Gentiles, to whom I am sending you, to open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light, and from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me. Now notice how this works according to Jesus. In order to receive forgiveness of sins, what do we need to do first? First, we need to turn from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God. And it is our turning from darkness and the power of Satan to God that results in our forgiveness. Then we will receive forgiveness of sins. We need to turn from the power of Satan to God in order to receive forgiveness. And Jesus suffered, died, and rose from the grave to make that happen. His death is the ransom that frees us from the power of Satan and sin. And so it brings about our forgiveness because it first brings about our turning back to God. But Jesus' death does not provide some kind of unconditional forgiveness. It does not give us some unconditional freedom of the future penalty of sin, the coming wrath of God. The cross is not some kind of a blank check that God writes to us so that no matter what evil things we may do going forward in the future, the blood of Jesus will cover it. That's how many evangelicals tend to think about the sacrifice Jesus made. I was listening to a sermon by the late Tim Keller back in 2011 or 12, and he explained that God cannot possibly condemn a true Christian because he cannot take two payments for the same sin. God could not receive one payment from Jesus, which pays for our sins, and then take another payment later from us if we keep sinning. No, that would be unjust. God can't do that. But that completely misunderstands the purpose of Jesus' death. Jesus wasn't paying some kind of a legal fine that makes it so that God is now obligated to save us if we only trust in what Jesus did on the cross. That's not how this works. Jesus was not paying a legal fine, but he was paying a ransom. He was paying the price to break our chains and free us from slavery to sin. As Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5:15, he died for all, that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him who for their sake died and was raised. So this idea of ransom is the right lens through which to interpret what Paul famously goes on to say in Romans 3:21-26. And I'm not going to get into the passage itself. I'm just going to encourage you to go and read it carefully and to keep in mind two things. First, notice the ambiguity of the passage. It's quite ambiguous, and it could be understood either through a ransom lens or through a penal substitution lens, or both. Especially if you just read it in isolation, it could go either way. But if you read it with the teaching of Jesus in the Gospels, if you read it with that in mind, and if you read it with passages like Romans 6 in mind, it will be helpful. It's talking about this ransom idea. And second, also know that the word redemption that's used in Romans 3:24, that word means ransom in full. It's talking about a ransom. It does not mean, nor does it imply, a penal substitution. And a lot of evangelicals seem to think that this is like the penal substitution passage. That's just something that people project onto this text post-Reformation. All right, thanks so much for taking the time to watch and to consider these things. In the next video, we will talk about Romans 4 and why, when Paul talks about works and how they do not play a role in justification in Romans 4, he's only talking about works of Mosaic law. He's not talking about good works of faithful obedience to Jesus. He's not saying that what we do after we have initially been saved plays no role in our final salvation. And I'll try to prove that to you in the next video in this series. Thanks so much for watching, and God bless you.